Good morning, European history students. This week you're going to be listening and learning and reading all about the New World conquest by the Europeans. I want you to focus on the divergent opinions regarding the experiences and the causes and the effects of the conquest. So we're going to start with a lecture today, and then as you move through the week, we're going to be looking at more and more documents about people's experiences with the conquest, either from the conqueror's point of view or from those who were conquered. And then your job is going to be to evaluate the sources to find out as much as you can the truth of history. All right, here goes the lecture on exploration and conquest.
Hi, good morning. We're going to be talking about exploration and conquest today by the Europeans of the New World or the Americas. So I like to start out with this image here first, where you see what looks like a conquistador with a flag that represents Christianity on the left-hand side. And you can see the ships behind, which were the famous fast-moving caravels. And you see an indigenous woman. And that indigenous woman is depicted without clothing and looks incredibly muscular. And then in the background, I don't know if you guys can see this, but there are some indigenous people, and it looks like they are roasting a human leg over a fire. Additionally, you see a lot of animals that almost look fantastical. And this was oftentimes how the Americas were depicted in travel journals that were sent back to or created in Europe. And what was interesting is a lot of the Europeans that created these drawings and these travel diaries didn't necessarily ever visit the Americas, but based their information on reports or diary entries from people who had, and then you added their imagination into it. So this is where we're going to move forward and figure out how they got there. So we're going to start kind of with the European history of travel and talking about map making and how that made it so that they didn't have this idea of this large world and how they stumbled upon the New World by accident. So we'll start there, and then we'll talk about the impact of this conquest of the New World. So cartography is the map-making skill, and in the 1400s or the 15th century, the world to the Europeans looked very different than the world looks today, and even than the world would look 100 years later for the Europeans. So we're going to look a little bit at the maps of the past and talk about the significance of the New World conquest for the Europeans. So this is a Ptolemaic map, and it was created about 150 AD. And if you see over here, and I'm going to hover over it, right here would be North Africa, and this would be the Nile River. And then you have Spain here, Italy, France, and England. And then over here to the right, you have the Indian Ocean and India all the way over into what would be Asia, China, Sri Lanka, that kind of thing. So this was created in about 150 AD. Now we know the Middle Ages, there was a loss of a lot of the map-making skills, and we also see a inward focus in Europe where there's not much focus on trade because there's so much infighting with feudalism and that kind of thing. Well, during the Renaissance and into the 1400s and 1500s, you're going to start to see a reemergence of a focus on discovery and exploration. And that's going to result in some changes to the map. But you have to understand, I'm going to show you a couple more maps here, that the change did not happen quickly. And in the Middle Ages, there was really a very narrow understanding of what the world was. So the map on the right is really kind of hard to see and understand, but the map on the left doesn't look like a map, but is actually a simplified version of what was supposed to be shown on the right, which is what's called a TO map. Now, a TO map was a Middle Ages map around the 1300s, and its focus was more on religion than accuracy of geography. So as you can see, there is an idea that there are essentially three land masses, Asia, Europe, and Africa, and that there are three main bodies of water that matter. The Nile and the Red Sea would kind of go together, and then you have the Mediterranean Sea and the Aegean and Black Seas. So you don't really even have the Atlantic Ocean. The Pacific Ocean is not where they would focus, and most of trade is over the Silk Road or over these narrow bodies of water. They would go down to the Indian Ocean, but not quite as often. So in the 1300s, this is the way Europe saw the world, and it really did kind of fall off at the edges. This is one of my favorite Renaissance paintings. It's by Hieronymus Bosch, and it's called The Garden of Earthly Delights. And on the inside, you can see what's on the right, which is a triptych. There's three different paintings that depict heaven, earth, and hell. And it was meant for an altar. But if you close it up, because it could be moved around, and it was painted on wood, so probably Northern Renaissance, right? If you close it up, what you can see is that there's a TO map on the outside showing Europe and then kind of the edges of where the earth fell off. So in the 1400s, map makers started to rediscover some of the early maps and to redo them with some added detail. And sometimes maps were even used as art on walls, and so they were really made to be beautiful. And this one was created in the 1400s, and as you can see, it's essentially a Ptolemaic map again. And Ptolemy, just so you know, is spelled with a P. So it's Ptolemy. So this is a Ptolemaic or a Ptolemaic map recreation that was done in the early Renaissance. You can see here that you've got, again, North Africa, the Nile River still being very important. You see the Ethiopian interior, and you just start to see some added detail. Now, if we take a step back and go to not just looking at the earth and looking at the universe in the 1400s to get an idea of what people believed about the universe, was usually based on what the teachings of the Catholic Church were on what Scripture said about the solar system. And as a result, you have Earth in the middle, and then you have the sun a little bit farther out from that, and the moon goes around the earth. And then you have some other, they knew about Venus, they knew about Mercury, but again, they believed that the earth was the center of the universe. We call this the geocentric model, and that everything traveled around the earth because earth was created and God created it, and man was created by God, and therefore the most important thing. So this was the model, and it will change as people start to focus on science, look for observation, and we start to see the development of the scientific revolution. So while Ptolemy's map making might have been a little more cutting edge for the time, in the Middle Ages, Ptolemy in 150 AD also believed that the earth was the center of the universe, and so had very kind of complex idea about how this would work. And even though Ptolemy actually observed some stars and would mark them, it was all in that system of thinking that was based on the Christian teachings of the earth being the center of the solar system. The first real person to challenge this was Copernicus in 1543, and he wrote a book on the revolution of heavenly spheres. This is something you should know, and the date would be very helpful for you. Most people make this the start of the scientific revolution. Copernicus's work would be published pretty much on his death, and so he did not get in trouble for these ideas, but 100 years later, Galileo would get in trouble for supporting these ideas with observation and mathematical calculations. But the difference here is obvious. Sol. The sun is now at the center of the universe, and even though these concentric circles are still wrong, there is obviously a change towards what is more like it is in reality. So 1543, on the revolution of heavenly spheres by Copernicus, he publishes that the sun is the center of the universe. This is called heliocentric. The sun is heliocentric, and then the previous idea was geocentric, which was the idea that the earth was the center of the universe. So as people are studying more and investigating more in Europe, map making begins to change. And you can see this is a map, it's called Mercator projection, and it's from 1565. And while there's still a lot of stuff in this map that makes it look like it wasn't really used for actual travel and cartography, but more for a wall in somebody's office, you do get the new ideas and explorations that have emerged. And over on the left-hand side, you will see the beginnings of the New World and the exploration that is occurring there. So why had Europeans begun to explore and look for new ways to get to Asia and to trade with India and some of the Asian nations? Was because of the growth of the Ottoman Empire. So you're seeing on this map the extent of the Ottoman Empire by 1566. And from a European perspective, they're pretty much surrounded if they go east to get resources. So what the Europeans are going to do is they're going to look for alternative routes that allow them to circumvent and get around the Ottoman Empire. And that's going to lead to their exploration of the New World and eventually their conquest of the New World. And the time period that we talk about for this exploration and conquest of the New World is from 1500s to the 1700s. So Vasco da Gama is an explorer from Portugal, and he is going to try to go around Africa, and he does in 1498 and is able to reach India. And you can see how the Portuguese are trying to skirt around the Ottoman Empire here. So initially the Europeans are exploring and attempting to set up new trade routes. And specifically, when the Europeans go around Africa and go towards Asia, they will set up for the most part what are called trading posts, which means they will work with the local indigenous population and they will figure out ways to trade with them. Now, this will change and when they go to the New World and realize that they can easily conquer. And at that point, then there's no more trading posts, but colonization will occur. But as you can see here, I wrote Portugal sets up trading posts on West Africa, India, and Indonesia, and they're doing that to bring spices from Asia into Europe. Now, when they get to those trading posts, they will find that they can also purchase human beings. And so that's when the slave trade begins. And eventually those people will be transported unwillingly to the New World as slaves and forced into labor. The Netherlands is another example of a country that is going to set up trading posts in Asia, and they have a company called the Dutch East India Company that is going to be very profitable for the Dutch and will actually help to fuel their renaissance. Europeans, I would say in general, usually respected and cooperated with local rulers in India, China, and Japan because they felt that they were equally matched and they would have a hard time actually subduing them. When they get to the New World, they're going to find something a little different. If you ever see this abbreviation, it's a VOC, you know that this is the Dutch East India Company. And you just get an idea of their trading routes if you look at the smaller map in the left-hand corner, where they start from Amsterdam and go down around Africa and then over into India and then into Indonesia. They're going mostly that way, so you see a lot of the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Italians and the British that are going to, given that this area is already pretty controlled, they're going to look to the New World to set up new colonies and to take over that area. So we'll be learning more about new imperialism in the late 1800s, but just to give you an idea, in Africa all the way up until 1880, Europeans are still around the outsides of the continent. This has to do for a couple different reasons. They didn't have access to a vaccination for malaria yet, so Europeans had a tendency to get very sick when they traveled within the continent of Africa. But also there was I don't want to call it a respect, but there was a belief that if they attempted to go in, the people that were there would fight them off, and they were equally matched with resources. You're going to see in the late 1800s when Europeans start to get weapons like machine guns, that they will actually go into Africa. But again, prior to this time period, in the time period we're studying right now, the 1500s to the 1700s, the Europeans are going to stay along the outsides of Africa and Asia and set up trading posts. The New World, though, is very different. The New World, when the Europeans stumble upon it, because they didn't realize that there were a couple of continents there, the Europeans are going to go ahead and conquer the area and set up colonies. And that results in the New World inhabitants being treated very poorly. You have mass extermination, essentially, whether it be by actual war or by disease of the indigenous population, and then the bringing over of slaves from Africa to set up the plantation and encomienda system in order to profit Europe and the European countries. You're going to be watching a video which will explain in details kind of why the experience in the New World for Europeans and their ability to take it over was different. But I really want you guys to focus on the fact that the Europeans had diseases that the New World had never experienced, and so it kind of, like a pandemic, wiped out a lot of their population. Additionally, the weaponry was more advanced in Europe, and so even though the indigenous people attempted very valiantly to fight off the Europeans, they often lost. And then on top of that, you have indigenous people fighting alongside of the Europeans because they were tired of being subjected to a rule of a larger group like the Aztecs or the Incas, and they wanted their freedom. And the result was that the indigenous people helped the Europeans fight against the empire that was controlling them, and then the Europeans went ahead and took them over as well. So on this slide, you're seeing what New World colonialism was like, and that Spain would create a huge empire, and you can see the green territory on the screen. You have the Portuguese also having a large area that would be modern-day Brazil, and that the indigenous people were severely subjugated, oftentimes enslaved, and that Portugal would make Brazil a sugar colony and would have to import massive numbers of slaves as they killed off the indigenous people. In North America, you're going to see England colonize, set up the 13 colonies and what would eventually become the United States of America. France will colonize Canada and some portions of North America as well, and then also Haiti. The Catholic Church will get involved early on with these explorations because the Europeans will quickly decide to fight over territory. And one of the most famous treaties that came out of the Pope kind of negotiating between Spain and Portugal was the Treaty of Tordesillas. I usually call it the Treaty of Tortilla, but Tordesillas. And the idea was to create a line, and from the west of the line would be Spanish and the east of the line would be Portuguese. And that line would slowly move over time as more and more territory was stumbled upon by the Europeans, and they realized, oh, this continent is much more vast than I thought. And then there would be an argument about where the line should move, and then the line would move further and further west. And eventually, if you go look back at the slide before, you saw that there was kind of Brazil was the area that the Portuguese got, and then the Spanish got all to the west of that. And it looked even until they found North America and they realized, oh, the Portuguese kind of got gypped. Now you'll get some of this in your reading, so I'm just going to go over it really quickly. But the Spanish are going to set up an empire in the New World, and they first are going to interact with the Aztecs of Mexico. Hernan Cortez is the Spanish conqueror that comes in and kind of wants to make peace, but I would really say that he attempts to take them over. The Aztecs push them out, so then Hernan Cortez actually starves them out, starves the capital city out by not allowing resources into them. And then when the group is weakened and they've died of disease, then Cortez comes in and kills their leader, Moctezuma. The Incas of Peru are another example of a large Native American empire, and you're going to have Pizarro come in and also conquer there and execute their leader. So those are just two examples. So once the Europeans come in and they conquer the New World, then along comes missionaries, and the missionaries from Europe have a couple of things that they want to accomplish, but most often they wanted to convert the captured native people to Christianity, and then eventually for them to accept European culture. Now, there were some religious leaders that felt natives were being treated poorly, and one of them that you will look at is Bartolomé de las Casas. And so you had, on both sides, you had religious leaders who really looked at the indigenous people and saw them as human, and then you have others that saw them as animals. And so the Catholic Church really struggled with how to treat the indigenous population in the New World. The Roman Catholic Church will become one of the most powerful forces in Latin America, and the Catholic Church will be responsible for a lot of the encomienda systems and the slavery that occurred. Eventually, the Catholic Church will fight against it, but there are many, many years where the Catholic Church is complicit in the enslavement of the indigenous people. So when the Europeans took over, they did exploit Latin America, specifically the conquistadors. They went over there hoping to get glory and gold, and so they conquered and they forced the indigenous people to labor in gold and silver mines, usually working them to death. Agriculturally, the Europeans who stayed would set up haciendas. They would be like plantations in the South in the United States. And then you would have peninsulares, who are people who were born in Spain, who would move to the New World in order to set up farming and ranching there, and they would use forced labor as well. There are also plantation systems set up for growing sugar, and they used slaves there, specifically in the West Indies, and those are the areas where it's most notorious for the indigenous population being wiped out rather quickly from that very hard labor. Also, there was this system in which the encomienda, I've mentioned it a couple of times, which is a formal grant of the right to labor of a specific number of indigenous people in the New World. So the encomienda system would essentially allow a hacienda to have the right of labor of the indigenous people for a certain amount of days. Eventually, it would become almost all the time. Repartimiento required all male Indians to devote a certain number of days of labor annually to the Spanish economic enterprises. So again, it's institutionalized slavery. And then you had debt peonage, which would be laborers required to purchase goods from the landowner to who they were forever indebted. So any money that they were paid, then they would essentially have to purchase all their goods from the landowner, and the landowner could charge whatever he wanted, so that they eventually would have no money. So we would call this essentially slavery. Initially, it's of the indigenous people. When the indigenous people aren't enough to run their plantation systems, they would then bring people in from Africa, and you'd have slavery, black slavery. So this is just one of the items that you're going to see in your textbook, which is the caravel. It was a fast-moving sailing ship that allowed the Europeans to move as quickly as they could across the Atlantic. Henry, the navigator of Portugal, was most famous for using the ship, but it would be used by sailors such as Columbus as well. So you may see some of these images on your AP test, so I just wanted to point them out. This one is by Theodore de Gaulle, and he created some prints of things that he wanted to draw attention to, either having to do with exploration or with the New World conquest. And this one obviously shows all of the tools, the new tools for navigation. You've got the caravel suspended there. You've got an astrolabe and some other items and the compass and all that kind of stuff that were used for navigation. Another thing that happened as a result of the conquest of the New World and exploration of the New World is an increasing desire by people in Europe to know what the New World was all about. And so this is a print by the same gentleman called Freedom of the Press or Expression. And you had a lot of diaries that were created about travels to the New World. And again, I mentioned earlier that not everyone who wrote a travel diary actually went to the New World, but they told you what it was like. So I'm not going to go through all the details of this one, but Nova Repreta is new inventions, and you can see on the left-hand side Christopher Columbus around the medallion of the New World, and then you've got all of these new inventions that helped for conquest. So look at all of the military inventions, the stirrups for horses, and then the cannon, all these things that allowed the Europeans to conquer the New World. So the impact in Europe is that at first the treatment of the indigenous population began to be condemned, but later Columbus and other explorers are going to be looked at as civilizing the New World, and they are definitely praised, and statues everywhere in Italy and Spain supporting Columbus. So there was an argument, and we'll get into that, as to the impact and if it was good or bad. There is a debate whether it's long-term or short-term what the impact was, but the indigenous population was pretty much wiped out, so I'm going to go for bad. Influx of spices and precious metals to Europe would result in what we call the price revolution, which was increasing prices and rapid inflation of items. And one of the most famous is the tulip craze that occurred in the Netherlands, where you could, one bulb, tulip bulb, could go for the price of essentially a house or more. It got so out of control, but it was because you had so much wealth and silver coming in from the New World that prices could rise and people could afford to pay them. Also, you're going to have new wealth increased in the expansion of printing, shipping, mining, textiles, and weapons industries. So the major conclusion I could say for you for the New World exploration and conquest is that you have over 300 years of overseas Spanish empires. You have Europe's largest and longest living trading bloc between Europe and the New World. You have an incredible exchange of biological animals and plants. You have also diseases that were exchanged, and then the Native American devastation, the indigenous population that was killed because of this conquest. So when you take lecture notes, just one reminder, you should have it in outline form. You need to make sure you have details. Notice that there wasn't as much on the screen. That doesn't mean you don't write anything down. I said a lot. And then you need to write a summary at the end. These are going to be highly helpful to you when you go to studying for a test, writing an essay, any of those kind of things. So you need to just make sure to take really good lecture notes.